I believe we're ready to get started. Welcome, Saturday evening here for tonight's panel discussion. Is empire a male concept? A bit of a speculative question to explore over the next 75 minutes, but it's Saturday night, so why not? An attempt to get inside the heads of dictators with our two panelists. Today we have, furthest from me, Rosemary Sullivan, and nearest to me, Oksana Lutsyshyna. I'll be introducing them in more depth momentarily. My name is Dimitri Nasrallah, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. I'm just a little word about myself. I'm an author as well of 4 novels, as well as the fiction editor for Véhicule Press here in Montreal. In particular to this panel, I published a novel in 2018 called The Bleeds, which speaks exactly to this subject, exploring the inner lives of dictators. So I spent a couple of years thinking about this, so I'm curious what you think. The panel description goes along these lines. What do dictators think about when they want to expand their power? Is the concept of empire inherently male? A discussion between 2 renowned women of letters and academics, Canadian essayist and biographer Rosemary Sullivan, and Ukrainian poet and novelist Oksana Lutsyshyna. Just before we get to the introductions, I'll note that we're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the discussion for any questions that the audience may have. And that the participants' books are available upstairs at the Festival Librairie Paragraph bookstore, which is just above us, I believe, as well as at Librairie Gaimard, which I believe has a bookstore hosted here somewhere as well. And there will be books at the table just outside the room. There's a book signing session that will take place after the event. I invite you as members of the audience to share any ongoing event photos or whatever you may be taking on social media with hashtag BlueMet2022 or hashtag MetBleu. 2022 in French. Without further ado, though, our panelists. Oksana Lutsyshyna was born in Uzhhorod in western Ukraine, which I believe has a quite interesting story behind its behind the meaning of its name, which maybe Oksana will explain to us later on. In 1974, she is a writer and translator and lecturer at in Ukrainian studies at the University of Texas in Austin, where she teaches the Ukrainian language and Eastern European literatures. She is the author of 4 collections of poetry, 1 collection of short stories, and 2 novels. Her most recent novel, Ivan and Phoebe, published in 2019, won 2 of the most prestigious literary awards in Ukraine, the Lviv City of Literature UNESCO Prize in 2020, and the Taras Shevchenko National Prize in Fiction in 2021. The novel chronicles the lives of several young people involved in the revolution on the Granite in 1990, a series of events that led to Ukraine's independence during the fall of the Soviet Empire. Ivan and Phoebe is forthcoming in English translation by Nina Murray from Deep Vellum Publishing next year. To Oksana's left is Rosemary Sullivan, Canadian poet, biographer, and anthologist. I'm sure you've seen some of her works around over the years. After spending the early part of her literary career focusing on poetry, she started writing biographies in the late 80s, beginning with the life of Elizabeth Smart in By Heart, Elizabeth Smart, A Life, which was published in 1991. Arguably, her first major work of biography is Shadow Maker, The Life of Gwendolyn McEwen, which was published in 1995. It won numerous awards, including the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction. That was followed by a biography of Margaret Atwood, The Red Shoes, Margaret Atwood Starting Out, which appeared in 1998. In this discussion of maleness and empire, it's worth noting that Sullivan's biographical subjects are all female, and that will figure into our conversation over the next 60 minutes. her two more recent books, the 2015 biography Stalin's Daughter, The Extraordinary and Tumultuous Life of Svetlana Alliluyeva, and The Betrayal of Anne Frank, a cold case investigation, which just came out this year, figure prominently for the conversation we're about to have about life under totalitarian and fascist regimes. The former of those two, Stalin's Daughter, won many awards: the RBC Taylor Prize for Nonfiction, the Hillary Weston Writers Prize, Writers Trust Nonfiction Prize, and was a finalist for the American Pen Award for Biography and the National Book Critics Circle Award. She was appointed an Officer of the Order of Canada, as well as a Guggenheim Fellow, among numerous other accolades. We could spend half of today's time just running down the biography, but we'll leave it there and get to the conversation, which is what we're here to do. Now, I mentioned at the top that we have quite a speculative question on our hands here, but before we get there, perhaps it would do us well to situate our two participants, to get a sense of the perspectives they're coming from, because you both bring quite different perspectives to this subject. I'd like to begin with you, Oksana, and to get a sense, because this is, from what I understand, the subject of Ivan and Phoebe as well, this generation of citizens, Ukrainian citizens, who were born under the Soviet Empire and then grew into this tumultuous independence that we now find ourselves leading to the current conflict. Perhaps we could start with childhood, life under the Soviet Empire. What was that like for you, and when did you first begin to feel the power construct of an empire around you?
It's a good question. On the one hand, always, and on the other hand, never, because of the Iron Curtain, we really didn't have much information about the world. I remember I was quite tired of hearing the word Lenin, and when the teacher once said in the first grade that we're going to watch another film about Lenin, I said, I don't want to watch about Lenin, I want to watch about the monkey. And nobody was happy to hear that. So I guess in this sense, you know, as a child, you feel that something is just right in your face all the time, and then it's not really all that pleasant. But the real awareness only came at the end of the 1980s, when finally there was this politics that Gorbachev called glasnost, which is basically talking about things finally, and when there started to be publications about different things, and some of them pertaining to what the Soviet Union was in itself, and the other what Ukraine was, because there were two situations there for Ukraine. One was totalitarianism, and the other one was colonialism, basically Russian colonialism. When, say, in my town, which is the very west of Ukraine and on the border with Slovakia, when we would have a celebration of, I don't know, Christmas, there would be this festival called Ruskaya Zima, Russian winter, because winter is always Russian. And my dad, who was born and raised in Western Ukraine, and nobody in Western Ukraine in their sane mind believed in communism, who was not really like a child like myself, but the older generation. He would never speak about it, you know, openly, but he would always point me into the, well, we would say now the right direction, except that it was the wrong direction, probably under the Soviet rule. And he would be like, look at this winter. What's Russian about it?
So your father didn't feel comfortable even speaking openly about things like that. It was to that degree of carefulness.
Oh, well, yes, and he had this, I mean, not just him, but everybody had to adopt these passive ways of resisting. Like, for example, everybody was supposed to speak Russian. Well, my dad spoke such bad Russian that nobody wanted to speak Russian to him.
So if there was resistance, it's passive.
He still does. It just
Rosemary, you've written about Anne Frank, and it allows us a bit of a parallel in terms of looking at another childhood and another time under a fascist regime. Can you take us through what you've learned about Anne Frank's childhood that it speaks to the notions of empire, or to what she underwent?
I came to this book sideways. Normally, I'm the total researcher, investigator. I wait at my door for the postman to arrive with the KGB and the CIA files and the FBI files. It's kind of fun when they kind of say, "Who are you?" I did all the interviews for instance, Stalin's daughter. I interviewed Stalin's grandson, Sasha Berdonsky, his daughter, the CIA officer. In this case, I was the writer. The project began in 2016 with two Dutchmen. And it was actually in its way a Dutch project because one of the Dutchmen, the man who initiated it, Thijs Bayen, was so disturbed by the world-turning right wing, the anti-immigrant sentiment in his country, which he had thought of as a liberated, liberal country. And he was passing Anne Frank House one day and saw people lined up, and he thought, you know, the issue of who betrayed Anne Frank, abstract as it is, has never been solved, and maybe that's a way to get the conversation going. And in the process of working, he found out that the rumors that were in the family but never really followed up were true, that his parents, his grandparents had hidden Jews during the Second World War. And he met a man in his 90s who described where the radio was hidden and so on. And he had a friend, Thijs Bayen, who was disturbed by the fact that he felt that the Netherlands had never really confronted the fact that about 72% of the Jewish population had been deported, more than in any other Western European country. And he wanted to know why, and he wanted the country to confront that. And he too found out, again, that the rumor in the family was true because he, oh. Do I have to start again? Has nobody heard anything? Yes? Hello? You can hear it now? Sorry. Anyway, I guess it's late at night. And he found out by searching through the archives of the resistance that his grandfather had also collected arms and hidden Jewish people. They decided to turn to an FBI investigator, an American, because they wanted somebody outside of Holland to do the investigation, since there had been a fairly large percentage of the Dutch police who had turned into collaborators, responding to a terrible strategy that the Nazis had of providing kopgels or bounties for every Jew that was found in hiding. In 2018, they asked me to join. I, like everybody, probably read Anne Frank when I was a child, 13, 14, especially because I grew up in Quebec in Catholic school. But when I was asked, I thought, well, maybe this is a really interesting way to confront what's going on now. And when you ask me about Anne Frank's childhood, when I decided to agree to write the book, I said we have to have a section of the book that is going to pull the reader in to an intimate understanding of what it was like. And so, in fact, it's not Anne Frank's voice that I have in the book, but in fact the helpers, Miep Gies, Bep Voskuil, describing what it was like to stay one night, overnight, in the secret annex, the terror, claustrophobia, the sense of fear of the inhabitants. So reading the diary now, and you can read the unexpurgated full edition in the revised official edition that came out in 1986, you see unbelievably, and it's odd, I don't make any association, but to be reading it in COVID when we are in our way incarcerated in our houses, not to anything like the degree that Anne Frank is. But here's this child who can't go and get her glasses fixed because she's terrified of going on the street because it's too dangerous. But the real person who drew me through the narrative was Otto Frank. And you ask about the relevance for today. Otto Frank and his wife went to dinner with friends in 1933, and they heard on the radio that Hitler had been nominated chancellor.
And the friends said, well, let's see what the man can do. Have we heard that before?
Yeah.
And then the cumulative, slow process, it was 8 years between his election and his final solution, the slow process of lies, propaganda, accumulation of untruths. There was a wonderful, this is the last thing I'll say, there was a wonderful statement by the strategic investigative sources in the United States that I found where they were examining the modus operandi of Hitler in 1943. And they said his operandi was say a lie, keep to the lie, identify who is the subject of the lie, and just keep going. And it sounded exactly like what's happening now.
Oksana, we've seen two ideas just rise out of what Rosemary was just discussing. The first is the falsification of information. The second is incremental implementation. Is that your experience with what happened in Ukraine as well under the Soviet Empire?
Yes, absolutely. Those were curated narratives, and we were just talking right before the event that, for example, in my Soviet childhood, there was no Anne Frank. Soviets somehow didn't really use that book for education of the young. They had other narratives that they used. And again, this is both in terms of totalitarian rule and colonial rule. So basically, you probably all heard this mythology of the history where we are these brotherly nations, with Russia being the older brother. And I know it's like confused gender right there. And everybody else is being the younger brother. And historically, this is not true because Moscow was founded in 1147 by Kiev Prince Yuri Dolgoruki. So absolutely, and we didn't even have an idea how far that reached until we learned some stuff in the beginning of independence and the end of the Soviet rule.
It's interesting that you phrase it as curated narratives, because I mean that's really what it is. We have an authoritative sense of how we're going to move forward with a story, and I wonder, to what degree do you see that, Rosemary, in the story of Anne Frank? We're still looking at this one individual story 80 years on. There's a fascination underway. It's a cultural phenomenon in a way, because there are many other stories out there. To what degree, what do we learn from this curated narrative?
I think that is a wonderful expression. I think that is a wonderful expression. I'm so used to Zooming, right, where you don't have to. What do we learn from the in my second chapter, having introduced the first chapter, or the preface, which is the it's about the raid itself. It's called the officer and the green, the raid and the green policeman. They call the SS the green policeman because they wore green uniforms. But the second one is about the diary. And I conclude that it's a living document. It's a very, very unnerving document. Because as she's writing, as Anne Frank, the child between the age of 13 and 15, is writing this book day by day, one thing she's doing is imagining herself as a novelist, and she thinks, I'm going to write a novel, and you won't know how it ends until it ends. And you know that the book is a living document, and it ends 3 days before they're arrested. The other way it's a living document is that it changes on the basis of who's reading it. So after the war, when Otto Frank in 1947 made an effort to get it published, it was a small book, but it turned into a big book when it was turned into first a piece of theater and then into a movie. But that was in the 50s, and the movie focused on a statement that Anne makes in her diary where she says, despite everything, I still have my ideals. Then if you look at the book, there's another statement which is the statement that surfaces in the 60s, where she says, until human beings learn to take care of each other, there is something murderous in human beings that will, until it's changed, destroy. I'm paraphrasing badly, but that's a different perspective on the diary. And so it does change in time. And now I think what's relevant about the Anne Frank story is, yes, this idea that we have somehow gotten back to a world of such ideological divisiveness, of conspiracy theories, of untruths, of people following one side or the other. And it's a prelude to the kind of thing that, it was very moving for me to discover who Otto Frank was. After that dinner party, he immediately left Germany. He could see what was coming. And then in the Netherlands, which he went to because his brother-in-law offered to help him start a company, he said we lived well, comfortably, not rich at all, but safely. And then by 1938, with Kristallnacht and so on, he started to try to get visas. He tried to get a visa in Rotterdam and couldn't, because Rotterdam was then later bombed by the Germans, but also the Americans withdrew all visas for, and then he finally tried in 1941 to get a visa to Cuba, and then what happened was the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the Cubans withdrew. And you watch this remarkable man, and his capacity to control his destiny is removed inch by inch by inch. And so it's a warning now. And I just heard that the wonderful director who did the amazing movie Waltz with Bashir is doing a movie called Looking for Anne Frank, and it'll be narrated by, or the character looking will be Kitty, the person to whom Anne Frank was writing her letters. So yes, it's never changes the relevance of the story.
Mm-hmm. I guess we're always looking towards, or we still hold in high regard that sense of individual dignity in the face of staunch authority, and those stories are still instructive to us. Oksana, your novel Ivan and Phoebe focuses in on the disintegration of empire, on the revolution on the granite. Several characters who lived through that and their personal lives at the time. You're looking at it some 3 decades on at this point. And what does that vantage point provide you with in terms of perspective when looking back at that time? What do you see now that maybe wasn't as evident in that moment?
Well, that I am lucky, and we're all lucky, because I don't know if most of us would have even survived this long if the Soviet Empire were to be still in business. So that's one thing. But you're right, it is a vantage point in many ways, and one of them is kind of like that moment where the past and the future kind of go backwards, relating to that point. So it's like a division, and nobody expected what was to come, and nobody knew how to look at the past anymore. And yes, we suddenly had this, and it coincided with my adulthood. I was 17 when the Soviet Union collapsed, so I was like a formed person. And when we started, that's when we started slowly to discover who we are. And Rosemary mentioned how Otto's capacity for doing stuff was basically, as his agency was removed, and we kind of lived in the state of very little agency. Suddenly we were saddled with the responsibility of exercise that agency, and we were not even sure how at first.
So that's a vantage point we see about 30 years on. I'll put this question out to both of you because, Rosemary, you have an involvement with PEN, is my understanding. So you look at these issues. Oksana, you have family and social network that lives close to empire. Are we sliding back into this age of empire after the idea was almost taken apart a generation ago as being a cautionary tale of what nations should not do? Have we forgotten that lesson, and are we going back in that direction? And what do you see happening? The microphone will be handy for this one.
You always have this fantasy that the last clarion call, the last extreme before things reform. And so you look around and you think, okay, there's Putin, there's Donald Trump, who's resurgent, there's Xi in China, there's North Korea, there's, it's astonishing. And at that point, you do say, is dictatorship rather than empire, is dictatorship male? Because it's the last clarion call of, and hopefully the last, unless they all succeed, right? Last clarion call of machismo, and against, it's anti-female, that's for sure. And so is it something to, are we sliding back? I don't know that we're sliding back, we're being slid back. And our helplessness is what seems to be so distressing. You know, in my family, we have somebody who drank the Kool-Aid and is, you know, anti-vax, believes in the New World Order, and it's Bill Gates who's doing it, and you go, is that my brother? You know, yeah, you were once an intelligent man, and you know, it's the helplessness that's so shocking.
Well, I think we're still dealing with the remnants of the old world. I mean, I'm not saying that the new elements didn't appear as well, but it's also, if you look at Putin, I mean, that's kind of, Russia kind of inherits whatever was the Soviet legacy, and Soviet Union in its turn inherited what was then Imperial Russia. So it's just somehow that country never came to any kind of important historical lessons in the amount that it probably should have. And it's still hoping to reestablish some sort of world domination and annex more countries and kind of make it Russia or call it Soviet Union or whatnot. So that's what it seems. And then as for the rest of the world and how it develops there, I don't know, perhaps each country has their story, or perhaps it's, again, the legacy of colonialism that we are not aware of necessarily in the amount that we should. And some people now say that it's social media, that social media actually make the dictatorship's job easier because it can spread the message and it becomes the message of hate very quickly. And it's like, everybody likes to hate you on Facebook and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't know. So perhaps it's just lots of tectonic things that are happening at the same time.
I mean, I guess this brings us to the million-dollar question of the evening, which is empire a male concept? Is there something in maleness that is leading to this dynamic?
I don't think it's a male concept. I think that usually dictators come up through the military system. You think of Putin, you know, KGB. I always was fascinated when I found out. I told you that I interviewed the CIA officer who helped her escape from India, defecting to the United States, and he gave me the originals of all his letters, about that many, which of course I copied in return. But she wrote to him and she said, "I cannot believe that Russia is electing a former KGB agent. They never change. He's a KGB guy." Trump is a absolutely dishonest, exploitative capitalist. And yet what is it in the United States that they have decided that there's this liberal elite that has, you know, made Trump a much more attractive prospect. You know, you can kind of think of the exclusive club. You know, the exclusive club means somebody's excluded, and so Trump's game is to, you know, just somehow keep pulling people in. So is it male? I don't think women have had a chance to be. You know, we were saying, you know, look at Indira Gandhi. She when she had the power, and she was a high Brahmin, so had no self-doubt, but she had the power to force sterilize huge swaths of the population. And I know Margaret Thatcher was not a dictator, but I love the idea of her fighting for the Falkland Islands. It was the only reason she was doing it was because she was going to lose the election. And then she wins the Falklands and gets elected. And luckily, I was for the Argentinians winning, right? But when she won, the dictatorship dissolved because these dictators, Videla and company, these male dictators, showed themselves to be so impotent. So yeah, I would imagine women could be dictators just as much as men. The only really, really true dictator I've ever run across is in fiction. And this is a book by Rydiger Harrod. Doesn't sound quite right. 19th century Victorian novelist who wrote a book called She. And it has the phrase, "she who must be obeyed." And he goes to Africa, the character, and in the core of Africa is this terrifying she who's a total dictator destroying everybody. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's a very male Victorian fantasy.
Is this idea that we've moved beyond these gender roles, an inherently Western one, Oksana? Is it different in Eastern Europe? Do we have a different dynamic underway there that feeds into this idea that the empire could be a male concept? Is there some truth to that question elsewhere?
I used to show this video excerpt to my students when I was teaching them about, I can't even say feminism necessarily in the Soviet Union, but let's say women's movements and stuff. And it's on this, on top of the mausoleum, that's when Lenin's mausoleum, that's where all the vozhds, the leaders, would stand during like May Day celebration or the October Revolution, which was actually November Revolution, and so on and so forth. And they all looked absolutely the same. They were men of a certain age, and they were all of the same height, and they wore the same kind of hat and the same kind of nondescript coat. And I would show them and say, how much do you think these men cared about women's reproductive rights or, maternity care or anything? It's like, look at them. They are just completely, and it's as if somebody literally selected them to be of us, that nondescript look kind of that they had. And when I don't know, I think that's just also talking about in a more global sense. It's also just the way history is written. Perhaps it is not about the gender, but about a certain power structure and aligning with it. And somehow it's easier to align it with it if you are male, because you would have access to power and education, or I don't know, the church ranks. I mean, that's another story. If we look, and it's how history was written before feminists interfered, or before minorities interfered and said, wait a minute, where is social history? How did women live during the reign of so-and-so or such and such king? And and that's kind of the history we studied at school too. It's even if we studied about a female ruler, and we did, because we studied Russian history, which was pretending to be the history of the whole region, right? Of course, there was Catherine, whom they called the Great, and other female rulers. But it's not like they were less of a imperial person, but they somehow it was almost like they became male symbolically, kind of like Catherine was actually called emperor, not empress, for a while, as far as I remember from those textbooks.
Rosemary, we've made a point of the fact that your biographies tend to focus on female protagonists. In doing so, I mean, there seems to be something in that speaks to the notion that maybe history is a male construct historically, traditionally. Is there something to that? Is that what we're working against at this point? Is that core patriarchy of curating the narrative? Is that a historically male construct?
I think you might be very right that history is a male construct, but that's not the motivation that led me to write those books. I think I mentioned earlier at a session that I went to the Soviet Union for the first time in '79 because I was bored and lonely living in England, and there was a sign saying Aeroflot, and it just seemed like a really interesting thing to do. So I went on my own, and I managed, because I knew somebody at the BBC, to meet the BBC reporter, and I met some dissidents. And then my colleague at U of T was Joseph Skoretsky from Prague, who fled in '68. And so I said, Joseph, I'm going to I need to find out if communism is only Russian. What's it like in Czechoslovakia? So I took a train to Czechoslovakia And I forgot to get some Czech money. So I arrived thinking there'd be a tourist bureau, you know, in the train station. There was nothing. So I had my German marks, and for some reason they worked in the telephone. And I called the number that Joseph gave me saying, never use my name, just say Toronto. So I said Toronto and was invited to visit this family. Then I organized this conference called The Writer in Human Rights in Aid of Amnesty, and one of the people there, because life is serendipitous, ended up as a publisher at Penguin. She knew I knew Elizabeth Smart. She said, why don't you write the biography? I said, I'd love to. She said, $5,000. I said, well, she said, oh, well, we can ask somebody else. I said, $5,000 is good. And then it was such a thrill to discover that biography is so much, you know, as a reader of biography, you get to read the story, but not the subtext. You know, visiting England, I don't know how many of you know the story of Elizabeth Smart, but she fell in love with a guy called George Barker by reading his poetry in a bookstore. And I met George, and I found out George's strategy with women was to make fun of you and knock you down, and then he built you up by complimenting you. And that was his strategy. And then I wrote about Gwendolyn McEwen, who I adored and knew. And then I was getting letters saying, you know, why are you drawn by these romantic, extremist, melancholic figures? And I thought, wow. So I went to Margaret Atwood and said, I want to write a book about you. And she said, I'm not dead. And I said, okay, we'll call it a not biography. And it was about her reaching the point of being able to be a mother, a wife, and a writer. And she said, well, look, if it's good, the cutest is yours. If it's bad, the brickbats will be mine. And I didn't get any brickbats. And then the next book was, biography was about a man. It was about a man called Varian Fry, American journalist, who I ran into in a film called Varian's War, which is a bad film. And he was such an interesting figure. He went to France in 1940 with $3,500 taped to his leg and a list of 200 people he was going to save. And he didn't know what, and a summer suit, you know, that's all he had. And he stayed 2 years and he saved about 2,000 people, including Max Ernst, Marc Chagall, you know, some of the, but also his mission was to save artists. So he'd take you down to the water and he'd say, draw that, and you'd do 3 sticks, and he'd say, good, you're an artist. And then you'd be on his list. Yeah.
I mean, so much of working on biographies is about adding to the education or to the re-education of a particular subject, adding new perspective. Oksana, I'm wondering, given that there is this active push into Ukraine for the growth of an empire at this point, when you're in the classroom, when you're actually dealing with the actual education of individuals, what are they asking at this point, and what do you tell them at this particular moment? What feeds this particular juncture in history, and how do you make sense of it for them?
Well, I usually try to answer questions as they come up, and it could be very different. And I have to say, sometimes people don't have any questions and don't want to hear anything. And I've noticed long ago that, you know, I don't write biographies. I guess I just kind of write autobiography, but only verbally. So if I tell them some story that illustrates a point, if it's at least somewhat personal, they kind of get it. But sometimes, even if you explain to people what you know, the Soviet world was about, it still doesn't meet any kind of understanding if it's just from even history books. Like I'll give you an example. There is a wonderful book that we read with students by Slavenka Drakulic, How We Survived Communism and Even Left. And it's not about the Soviet Union, it's about everything else that was kind of within the zone of influence of socialist, Marxist ideas. But the problem is communism never existed. She uses the word kind of ironically, like we all do for the lack of a better term. But what is communism? It's a kind of a society where everything is free and nobody actually knows what it is. And even our leaders had no idea. And we would ask a teacher at school, like, when is communism coming? Because we were promised that it will happen within our generation. What will happen? And the teacher would start thinking and be like, well, you know, it's when you go to the store and everything is for free. And we're like, but if it's for free, why is it in the store? And so basically, there was never any vision of communism. That's what I mean. Like, nobody understands what it is about. But it's not apparent to people when they encounter the term. And then when we talk about women's rights, and they try to analyze some women writers from today, contemporaries, and they would be like, oh, okay, we Googled it, and it said that Soviet Marxist feminist thinkers, there was Alexandra Kollontai, and it's completely irrelevant because that's from the 1920s, and none of those ideas materialized, like a kind of a daycare, centers for women, factories, kitchens that would prepare food, and so on and so forth.
I mean, when we're talking about this notion of communism as being the driving force of the empire that got left behind, but it's not the driving force of the empire that's moving back in now. We're not going to be seeing communism. How would we describe what's going to be there if it's not that unifying principle of communism? Then what is it going to be?
Well, that's a good question. I guess in the case of Russia, it's just Russian nationalism, and also one of the narratives that's much exploited is actually the narrative of denazification. Supposedly, Ukraine has Nazis, and again, that's a narrative that the world finds recognizable, you know, and especially considering the history in which Soviet Union was on the side of, you know, the good guys, and oh, there's Nazis there, so let's listen to, well, maybe there are Nazis, and then they look and there are no Nazis, and we have a Jew for a president, so it just kind of doesn't work. But again, I think there's several pieces to this story from what I was able to discern. One would be, yes, the sort of the Russian thing, and the other, and the Russian in the sense of Россияnin, not Ruski, not so much the ethnicity necessarily as the citizenship, which unites many peoples. And the other would be that what does it mean to be Russian? It means to fight the Nazis.
I mean, Rosemary, denazification, that's part out of that's out of Stalin's playbook. That worked really well there. How much of this goes back to Joseph Stalin and some of the ideologies that he began to put forth? Are we seeing some of these characteristics come back up? And what parallels do you see there from the research you've done on Stalin?
Well, before you do that, before I answer that, I was going to say that when I was in Russia in 2013. I passed the Duma, and it was the point where the validation of the family and the anti-poverty, anti-gay movement was very strong. So there was a demonstration out in front, and behind there was one little woman saying, "How did we end up being governed by this company of assholes?" And I thought, you know, she might be a plant to say that, you know, there's freedom of speech or something. So I don't know. I feel that what we're seeing with Putin, I have no basis other than my own impressions to say this, but is a man's particular personal program. What was so strange about the last years of Stalin was his paranoia, unbelievable level of paranoia. And I don't know if you've seen the film The Death of Stalin. Yeah, it's a very funny satire, and it's pretty close to the truth if you read Svetlana's 20 Letters to a Friend and Khrushchev's reports and stuff like that. But here's Stalin. Everybody's terrified of the man and won't... he says, don't disturb him, and so nothing happens till 10 o'clock at night, and they find out that he's been unconscious or in his own feces on the floor for about 4 hours, and when they want to get doctors, he has had all the doctors arrested for the doctor's plot. And so there's a wonderful book by a man called Dr. Rappaport, and he describes what it was like to be in prison, and somebody comes down to him and says he's expecting this is going to be the final execution because he's been warned that even Stalin has been watching and he's been tortured, and somebody comes, an officer comes down and says, if you have such and such a condition, what does it mean? They're really asking about Stalin because he's the only doctor who's, at Lubyanka. And I think that Putin may be moving in the same level of paranoia. It was clear that Beria was gunning for Stalin's job, and he always anticipated getting anybody out of the way that was threatening him. And there's a wonderful CBC documentary about Putin, and it starts off, and it's a picture of a cathedral, a church, with wonderful Russian icons and a saint sitting in a bathtub. And here's the next one is Putin sitting in the same bathtub without a shirt. Not on a horse this time, right? But he's keeping the things tight. He wants to make his legacy known. You probably know that Stalin arrested his relatives. He arrested Evgenia. He arrested Anne. They knew the real Stalin, and he wanted the glorified legacy. So, in fact, they were 7 years in prison until he died, and then Khrushchev released them. But the egomania and the paranoia that develops when you have that level of power is an illness, and we're living it, I think.
I think we've just touched upon the third characteristic of, I guess, this male concept of authority that we've been talking about. The first being this craving of power, the second being this sense of paranoia that develops over time. And now this, once you arrive to a certain age, this notion of legacy. How are you going to preserve elements of this and move on? And I'd like to put the question to both of you. Where are we now with this question of legacy? Is it a notion of arriving at a certain age or having been in power to a certain degree that there's something in the male persona, the male personas that we're seeing, that we're talking about, in which legacy becomes predominant? No need to arm wrestle to answer first.
Putin is 70. He is 70, and he has a paranoia about the United States. And I hope I can say this in a way that is measured. He has some reason, but not to the degree of murderousness that he's talking about. The post-war CIA stuff going on was pretty heavy stuff, right? But I don't know. I mean, women legacy, maybe. I don't like to get into gender stuff. I mean, when you can have children, maybe, that can be your legacy. And women who don't have children, maybe they're just not so wrapped up in this. I think legacy is absurd, frankly, in a global pandemic with global warming and the potential disintegration of the planet. Putin's legacy is not going to last very long if we don't get that solved before everything else.
Well, there's definitely it is. I agree that it is personal with him. I mean, he seems to be harboring a pretty deep hatred for example, Ukraine. So destroying it is kind of his task, because what the Russians are doing there doesn't even look like a conquest. It looks like annihilation, and it's not just they're basically specifically targeting civilians. And they've just bombed several very important museums, and they destroyed a bunch of things that we consider legacy. So it's like they attack the legacy because they want to, leave this legacy of nothingness. And then these Russian soldiers that sometimes get captured and interrogated, and it turns out that they have no idea where they are and what they're doing. And then again, it tells us something. Some of them are like in this movie Ender's Game. They're like, oh, but we thought we were in the training grounds. We didn't know we were in Ukraine. We were not told. And then the others actually have no idea what Ukraine even is, because in their textbooks it's all Russia. So like that's already a certain imprint in the minds of people. So and it's like a huge country that is situated on 2 continents, and I don't know, it's what kind of legacy. And yet the whole world knows the song about Putin that our soccer fans composed. It's a really bad language, so I'm not going to produce it. But
oh, please.
but it's been there was like flash mobs, people singing it in different countries, and I'm like, okay, well, Putin got his legacy.
Well, since we are firmly on the Saturday evening part of the discussion, and we're already in this parlor debate about gender and power dynamics, I'd like to throw a contrast into the conversation. Well, let's look at the stewardship of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, someone who's been in power for a very long time. Arguably, no such characteristics match up there. Is there an inherent difference there? Is it just down to individual, or is she's someone who's going to leave a pretty deep legacy through completely different means? What do we make of that?
That we have to be very careful of generalizations, because yeah, Angela Merkel is leading a democracy, and it is a democracy, however fragile all our democracies are. Golda Meir was a woman in a particular moment in time. And even Margaret Thatcher, you know, well, no. Yeah, she and Ronald Reagan. On Saturday night, I'm allowed to say I didn't like either of them. But so yeah, I think gender is such a tricky thing to apply. I grew up thinking I was half a boy, you know. I had this fantasy. We lived on the West Island, and in the area of Lakeside Heights, which I didn't realize till I grew up. These were all houses that veterans had been given as compensation for fighting in the war. So there were these little houses, and half the guys were probably, you know, post-traumatic syndrome. But I would go to the bottom of the street and run through the woods, and I'd have to touch a tree. And then go running back, and I didn't call it then, I called it now, running into my fear. So I mean, I think we're all multi-gendered. In fact, there's a wonderful book by Ursula Le Guin called The Left Hand of Darkness, in which there's 14 genders. So I think we should be living in that world.
We've opened up a number of questions here. We've heard a number of insights. I wonder what the audience is thinking. If they have questions for our panelists. Yes?
I think the notion of empire has also changed, because we keep talking of empire we don't like. But Queen Victoria has
Exactly.
Queen Elizabeth arguably with the Commonwealth.
Yep.
And it seems that depending on the empire we talk, so the one we don't like are male.
The one we like.
The notion of empire for sure has changed. Yeah.
It's an important point, and maybe we're talking about imperialism, but you know, imperialism with the British under Victoria, imperialism.
Microphone.
In American imperialism. Oh. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Maybe we should, you know, we should be talking about imperialism, British imperialism under Victoria and the current Commonwealth, American imperialism, especially in Latin America. My husband is Chilean, and I was in Chile in 1985 during, you know, the Pinochet years, and you did understand that. There is very strong evidence that the Americans were complicit in the Condor project, which was the one dictatorship after another, from Uruguay through Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, etc. So you're right. We have to be careful of the term.
But also the empires associated the power somehow with the male power, even if the queen was female. Didn't these old maps feature, you know, like say America or Africa portrayed as these beautiful naked women that are just lying there with all the riches waiting for the European he to come and conquer them, as far as I remember. So it's almost like you're right, gender stopped existing as such. It's sort of like a symbolic gender prevailed, with whoever's in power being associated with something more or less male, just because people were used to associating power with a male, with males. I don't know.
We have a question. We have a question over there.
So where does the notion of Mother Russia come from?
Oh, I wouldn't know. Well, I think it's partly linguistics, perhaps, because in the Slavic languages, there could be this, the gender, even the word country is a she. So that might be some sort of explanation. But then the word for motherland would be Atchizna. Oh, that's kind of actually more like fatherland. So I don't know. But yeah, I would think that there's a lot of symbols of how you call the country, and actually the name Russia is also a she, right? So that could work.
But then it's the male ruler's relationship with the she, which is in a sense one of domination. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and actually for World War II they had this the posters that had like a mother Russia. Well, motherland is calling, like basically. Well, U.S. had Uncle Sam actually, but we had this Soviet mother.
Do we have any other questions? Going once? Going twice? All right, on that note, I'm looking for the final pages of what we're supposed to. I'm supposed to thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you, Oksana. Oh, we have a question.
It's a silly little question, but Otto Frank, was there a relationship with Anne Frank? I mean, were they somehow...
He was her father.
Well, that was her father.
Her father. Otto was her father. Sorry, I should... Yeah, Otto was her father. I should have been clear about that. And so he was German. His wife could trace her ancestry back to the 16th century in German. His Jewish wife. He fought in the First World War when the German government asked Jews to come and protect their motherland, fatherland. Yeah, probably fatherland. They had two children, Margot, and who was 3 years older than Anne, who was born in 1928. Yeah.
If I can, I'm intrigued by what you said there, that Anne was not a model in the Russian environment there, because depending on the country you look at, Anne of Green Gable is preferred. Fifi Brendacier, the Swedish young lady there, what was it in your universe?
That's a great question, because actually we almost didn't have a female role model for that kind of age. And we did have, I guess, a counterpart to Anne Frank in the sense that she was a little martyr, but there was not much narrative attached to that, because the diary of this girl, Tanya Savicheva of Leningrad, who died during the siege of Leningrad, was very short. There were just literally few sentences. Mother died, father died, everybody died. So, and there was no young adult literature much either. So we grew up reading, I don't know, The Treasure Island, where everybody is a male and a psychopath.
And also one could add that there was not an emphasis on the Holocaust in the Soviet Union.
Yes,
they spoke of the Russian soldiers who died and in the concentration camps and the Roma and so on, but they weren't acknowledging. Yeah.
But don't you think that, when I read about the losses that the Russians had in the Second World War, like 27 million people, and they were really the ones who were in Berlin a month before the Allied forces came in from the West. Don't you think that, without, and I know it's not just the Russians, I think it was all the Slavic people that were involved in this, but don't you think Westerners should be a little bit more grateful?
Russia won the war.
Russia won the war.
They did. Well, yeah. I mean, yeah.
I
Well, partly the losses were so huge because Stalin refused to, you know, be an actual leader who would be sane, and he would like command the people. That was the completely impossible, conflicting commands, the orders that the soldiers were giving. Наступать обороняясь, you should attack while defending. Anybody who's been in the military would probably say that that's kind of impossible. Or there would be, okay, the October Revolution anniversary is coming forth, so let's just retake Kiev. And the fact that there would be 100,000 dead trying to do that, and that wouldn't be possible anyway, that somehow Stalin didn't think about. Then Stalin issued this law according to which anybody who surrendered to be a prisoner of war was a traitor, and actually Rosemary has it in her book on Svetlana Alliluyeva that was a horrible thing to do. So, and the losses were not 27 million. They were actually, right now, historians saying that it's closer to 60 million. There's like the whole forests of Ukraine and Belarus have still have bones that people keep running into.
I mean, for sure. I mean, Stalin was, you know, the instigator of so many of the deaths. I mean, but still, the losses.
It was interesting writing about Svetlana because to say that Russia is synonymous with Putin is a mistake. I mean, it's a very rich, powerful culture. And she was kind of almost a throwback, in a way, to you know, an older, the world of Dostoevsky, the intellectual world of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and you know, that very rich tradition. So. Yeah, you're right. But Putin is making a big mess right now.
Do you have any sense of Putin's daughter? Because we hear about that.
Yeah, he has 2 daughters and 2 sons, and he doesn't acknowledge the sons. He only acknowledges the daughter. And all we know now is that they've been they're abroad, and they like the oligarchs have had their bank accounts frozen. But no, I mean, he's very careful to keep his family private. Oh, I do have a nasty story to tell, though.
We have time.
We have time? When I was doing my research for Stalin's daughter, one of the big sources is the NARA files, the National Archives in the United States. But they're so sophisticated that you're much better off hiring somebody to do the research for you. Because they're so complicated. So I looked to the list of people, and the most expensive was a guy called Sim Smiley. And I thought, okay, he'll be the fastest. So I hired Sim Smiley, and it turned out to be a woman. And Sim was great. I went to visit her in Washington. She was such a professional researcher. She found me material in Stanford and so on. But anyway, she talked about a dinner party she had in Italy. And it was a dinner party hosted by Berlusconi, because Sim was also a very high-level State Department translator. On one side was Bush. On the other side was Clinton and Hillary Clinton and so on. It was that level of a dinner party, but intimate. And Berlusconi started talking about going and visiting Putin at his private residence in Russia. And he said, you know, when he was greeted at the door, there were these scantily clad women who led him to the table. And by the dessert, they were naked. And Putin said, pick 1, pick 2, pick 3. And Berlusconi said, maybe not tonight. And Bill Clinton said, good idea. Good idea to refuse.
Well, I actually wanted to return for a second to the idea of the Russian culture, and a Ukrainian writer, Oksana Zabushko, just published an article, I think it was in Times Literary Supplement or something. It was how to evaluate Russian culture after the massacre of Bucha, which is a Ukrainian town that probably saw photographs of. And basically it's a kind of a post-colonial critique, and actually scholars are talking about it right now, that we have to revisit the canon. And I know that people are making a lot of effort now to kind of not equate Soviets with the Russians, but it's still the first thing that comes to mind is still Russian. Or you know, and the fact that actually it was mainly Ukrainian armies that entered Berlin, like, but it just wasn't called that, somehow escapes the attention. And what kind of stuff the Soviet soldiers did in that month in Berlin, which they took before the Allies came, they basically raped everybody. That's another story that we need to hear about the Russian army, if it's to be called that. And so basically returning to the post-colonial critique, that the Russian writer Piotr Weil, who's died by now, he used to live in New York actually. He has this great essay about the morality of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, that by now in Putin's times is pretty much, he calls it a phantom pain. So, and basically this now, even at my department, people are kind of looking at what we are reading and how we are taking it, because even within the Soviet Union, it was considered that Russian literature encompassed universal values, that it spoke about things so universal that there could be nothing more universal. And finally, scholars came to the point where they said, wait a minute, it doesn't work like that. It probably is still situated in a particular epoch, and it's probably not as universal as it seems. So, you know, like Anna Karenina would be equated with, you know, the story of love, but again, let's disentangle these things.
Do you think that, I mean, you know, the Russians have risen up before, like when they overthrew the Tsar and Tsarina. Is it possible that they could rise up against what's happening now? I mean, there certainly is an undercurrent of dissatisfaction, and you know, there's a lot of repression. But what do you think? Do you think that could ever happen? Like,
Well,
getting overthrown?
well, one would hope. I can't tell, but again, the Russian Revolution had a second chapter. They overthrew the Tsar, but then the Bolsheviks rose to power by, you know, by coup, by basically usurping power. Which, you know, the Tsar was deposed in what, February, and then okay, let's have the parliament. But then the Bolsheviks were just one of the party, part of the Communist Party, the bigger part. That's why the Bolsheviks, because Russian word "bolshe" means more. So, but then these lovely majorities showed up to the parliament, realized they didn't win as many seats as they liked, and then they were like, okay, let's just bring guns into the parliament, and now we have won the seats we wanted. So, and I don't know, I mean, revolutions always have that danger, whether in Russia or elsewhere, so it would be good, but I don't know, I honestly cannot make prognosis. Yeah, it's very hard right now.
Thank you, Oksana. Thank you, Rosemary, for taking the time to speculate with us this Saturday evening. Thank you all for listening. I'll just remind you that if you want to continue the conversations with our participants, they're here and happy to speak. They'll be signing books outside. There are books upstairs for you to buy, to peruse. Other than that, it's Saturday night. There are books and writers all over the building, so hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for being with us.
And thank you for being such a wonderful, intelligent host.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you
You
so
made
much.
the evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dimitri.